thank you all, for taking the time to attend this, very important industry engagement between HHS, ASPR, and IBMSC. I'll try to keep my remarks relatively brief as I want to make sure that we have questions and answers during this collaborative session. So I will say, just from a strategic and directional perspective, the ASPR Acquisition and Assistance Enterprise is going to support IBMSC requirements using kind of an all-of-the-above approach. From a solicitation perspective, we're going to leverage broad agency announcements or BAAs. We're also going to look at commercial solutions opening like, acquisition mechanisms. I'll just say that ASPR itself does not have CSO authority, but you can replicate that kind of solicitation mechanism via FAR Part 12 commercial contracting procedures. So if for those of you who are familiar dealing with DoD and DHS and other organizations that do have CSO authority, we're going to be looking to model something like that, even though we do not necessarily have specific CSO authority. From an award perspective, again, just following along with this kind of all of the above approach, we're going to be looking at, traditional FAR-based contracts, other transaction authority agreements, and even, cooperative agreements. So, we feel that most of IBMSC's requirements will likely be, awarded through acquisition mechanisms, but that doesn't mean that, IBMSC wouldn't necessarily play in the assistance space and wouldn't necessarily, wouldn't rule out cooperative agreements when it's appropriate to do so, when their investments will accrue to the American people as opposed to any specific requirement that IBMSC has. Just thinking more kind of strategically, from, the IBMSC perspective when it comes to acquisitions and kind of what type of, industry partners we're going to be looking at kind of working with. I just want to highlight that as we're looking through that space, particularly from the ASPR contracting perspective, we're going to be looking at vendors that can survive, compete, and thrive in the commercial marketplace with no kind of United States government intervention. And I kind of am very specifically using the word no in like all caps, because ultimately at the end of the day, obviously the ASPR's budget is public information, right? The rescissions of COVID-19 funding that HHS and the ASPR have to absorb, that's all public information. So for the good or the bad, fortunately, unfortunately, public health spending, in this country kind of follows a boom and bust type of cycle. Obviously the public health, emergency response for COVID-19 was the boom. And it is now following kind of a bust or a shrinking period, because ultimately at the end of the day, when you pick up the newspaper, there are other priorities that are on the front lines, or on the headlines, excuse me. I mean, headlines and front lines, right? Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, some of these other kind of major geopolitical, events are dominating headlines, and therefore they dominate budget cycles. So when we talk about the boom and bust in public health, in public health spending in this country, we have to have industry partners that recognize and have a plan to address the 95% of the addressable market. The U.S. government, that's DoD, massive healthcare system for our active duty troops, right? VA, massive healthcare system for our veterans. HHS and ASPR, we collectively only kind of play in about 5% of the market for medical products and supplies. So we're just not going to be able to sustain any particular company or any particular industry in a real and effective way. You have to be able to compete in, again, that 95% of your addressable market and not just focus on government investments, because ultimately that's maybe not a kind of a winning strategy. So that's kind of what we're looking at, when it comes to kind of industry partners that, we want to be doing business with. I will say, and this comes up a lot in these types of discussions, that there are real world macroeconomic issues out there in this space. Obviously foreign competition, foreign competitors dumping products into the U.S. marketplace, which causes prices to nosedive and become unprofitable for industries. Like, we understand those are all real world issues, but we just, from the ASPR contracting perspective, we want y'all to understand that federal contracting, ASPR contracting is not the tool to solve those larger issues. Again, federal procurements, ASPR procurements cannot solve these major macroeconomic issues. We need our colleagues on the Hill. We need our colleagues within the executive branch who have relevant authorities to kind of address those issues. So again, I think IBMSC through ASPR contracting will make the strategic investments that are necessary, to prepare this country for the next pandemic and ensure we have a robust, medical supply chain and are able to have that kind of industrial base that can respond in the event of a public health emergency. But again, we're not going to be a sustainer, we're not going to be a financer, and we're not the only funder or the funder of last resort for our industry partners. So I think that's something that's very critical, for industry partners to understand about ASPR contracting and kind of some of the investments that we'll make on behalf of the IBMSC program office. So lastly, so that's kind of like a big kind of macroeconomic picture, but as we kind of look down, more closely within ASPR itself, I did just kind of want to make the point as well, about IBMSC, their requirements, their contracting, and how that either feeds into or does not feed into the Strategic National Stockpile. This has been kind of an ongoing discussion, for a while. IBMSC, obviously, they're going to make strategic investments in, medical product supply chain, ensure that we have a good, industrial base, but their remit is much larger than just kind of the SNS specifically. And I remember, when Joe Hamill and I were talking about how this office was kind of coming together and how it was going to be set up, my mindset was IBMSC is going to make investments directly into what the SNS is going to buy. And, Joe was like, no, we're going to be looking much broader, right? We're going to be looking at, again, this nation's public health preparedness and being able to respond. And the SNS may or may not be interested in some of the investments that we're making because they don't stockpile or procure that. For those of you who play in the SNS space, you certainly know that, the SNS is driven by a formulary, right? Their formulary is driven by the FEMC, that interagency organization and interagency process to determine, through material threat assessments, what should go into the SNS. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive what's put into the SNS, and IBMSC will make investments that are necessary, again, to prepare this country from a public health perspective, and those two will meet at some points, and those two will not meet at other points. So I just don't want our industry partners to think about this, that there's a one-to-one correlation between IBMSC investments and SNS procurements and stockpiling. And again, that ties back to my original point of, make sure that you have a plan to address, the 95% of the market that the U.S. government does not make up. So those are just a few key points that I wanted to make here. Again, I intentionally kept it brief. If there are questions and, since that we have time, certainly I'm happy to answer any questions or have any discussions specifically for ASPR contracting and our support, to the IBMSC program office. But I'll close by saying, thank you very much for taking the time and I'll open up the floor.
Hi, thank you very much. Great presentation so far. My question is this: is there room for factory direct orders with factories that have already been funded by the U.S. government? And how would you propose we go about that? For number one, we're Renco Corporation, and we were funded through the DPA to make lots of gloves. And the one thing that we need is orders. That will sustain us, not money, orders. So thank you. If you could respond on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think, from my perspective, I'm familiar with Renco, I'm familiar with that situation, so I'll speak more broadly about it as opposed to specifically. This kind of does go to what I just said, right? I mean, unfortunately, with the SNS and their formulary and, what is driven by what they are required to hold, the orders for gloves specifically or any other PPE product are going to be driven by, that interagency requirement set by the FEMC, right? And what I will say is that interagency process determines needs, but it does not determine funding. And I think that's a key, that's a key difference, right? I mean, SNS probably has several $1 billion worth of requirements, but again, their budget is public information, right? So I'm not giving anything away. Their budget is, I think, $980 million, right? So you have several $1 billion in requirements. You have $980 million to make that work. So the SNS director is unfortunately in a very tough position to try to make trade-offs, right, to meet as much as they can with MC requirements within that very limited budget. So I think that, from my perspective, and we tell vendors this quite regularly, we need you out there, talking to, legislators, appropriators, just like we do, right? Like we do the same thing, right? Like we tell them, like, look, SNS has this many requirements, right? IBMSC has this many requirements, but when you give them this amount of money, something is going to break in between, right? And we need, some sustain, not even just higher levels of funding. It's really more sustained funding, I think, again, to kind of get away from that boom and bust cycle. So unfortunately, I can't give you a good or satisfying answer because I know that's totally not satisfying in any way. But what I'm saying is that's just unfortunately the reality of it, right? Like we do have requirements for gloves. Period, point blank. We have requirements for gloves. We have requirements for all matter of PPE, but guess what? SNS can't fund it. And SNS does have to prioritize kind of those bespoke medical countermeasures that we're the only buyer for, right? Like we are obviously not the only buyer of gloves. We're not the only buyer of N95s. We're not the only buyer of isolation gowns. We're not the only buyer of many of these things, right? But we are the only buyer for, anthrax antitoxin and things like that. Like that's not something that you go to Walmart to pick up, right? Whenever, hey, I might have been exposed to anthrax, so I'll just go to Walmart and get it, right? Like that's not the way that it works. So SNS does have to prioritize that, but that doesn't mean that we all shouldn't collectively be working on, trying to increase the pot so we can make some of these more strategic investments that IBMSC increases the capacity, and then SNS can kind of take advantage of that with the funding that is available to them. So again, not a satisfying answer, but that's the real answer. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. So I think there's a perception sometimes that HHS contracting is slow, runs into roadblocks, things like that. Number one, I'd like your thoughts on whether that perception is, in your mind, accurate, and number two, your thoughts about what HHS contracting, acquisition can do to speed up, the entire process and make it more efficient.
Yeah. So I will say that it is slow, right? I will say that it is slow, and it's slow not necessarily because ASPR contracting is slow. It moves slow because as I often tell people, if you're not satisfied with the way that and it's not just ASPR contracting, but federal contracting in general works, unfortunately, like your HCA and your contracting officers are not necessarily the right people. We're enforcement mechanisms for the rules as they are written, right? We are spending public funds, right? And there are so many rules, regulations all around that, very highly, litigation centered, right? Like contracting is simply a preparation for litigation. Like that's all, like, if no one's ever told you that, that's all contracting is. Contracting is a preparation for litigation. Like all we do is to prepare for litigation, right? And some of our procurements, which are publicly known, a lot of litigation, right? A lot of litigation. I think that has to do with, again, to tie back to some of the things that I said, initially, when it's boom and bust, and now we're in the bust, this is the last kind of shot, I think. I think many vendors realize this is the last chance to get the money from ASPR, and we're going to fight for it, right? And it's because we're spending public money, it is absolutely your right to fight for it, and I encourage, I'm the HCA, I encourage any vendor, like if they feel that the ASPR has made a mistake, you have mechanisms and outlets for that, you should take advantage of them, right? You should take advantage of them. Agency is given broad discretion to make decisions, so you may not disagree with our decision. GAO or any other body might not necessarily agree with our decision, but as long as we're following what we said, our decision is going to hold, but you certainly have your say in that, right? In terms of kind of what can we do better, that's actually an intense topic of discussion within the ASPR itself. Certainly working more closely with Arlene and Joe and our program partners to ensure that, we do, not necessarily appropriate, but that we do really, really good market research, that we understand what our requirement is, we understand what the market is to actually address that requirement and determine the right acquisition strategy and plan. I think that's going to go a long way, to kind of help improve kind of our outcomes and improve our timelines. But ultimately, at the end of the day, again, protests are going to happen because of the very nature of what we're doing, very nature of what we're buying, and I think the very nature of the budget reality that we're in. And I think vendors are kind of correctly thinking that, hey, this might be my last shot for a while, right? Like this is going to be kind of it for ASPR because, again, the domination of the headlines, for other things that are much more important. I mean, look at the aid package that just passed for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan and Indo-Pacific, right? Like that's where the appropriators' minds are. That's where the country's mind is. That's where the leadership mind is. So we have this small little pot that's shrinking, and we're trying to make awards, but the vendors are going to fight for it, right? And again, they certainly should, but we'll do everything on our side, again, to improve our requirements definition, to improve our market research, to improve our acquisition planning, to try to get the best solution in place to meet the requirements of IBMSC. Anybody else? I think Mike's right there, sir, and then you are next.
Hello, Ben Eloff from Healthcare Innovation Catalysts. I have a three-parter for you. Before I get to that, though, as a reformed project officer and core, I want to say I appreciate how much volume of work your organization has done, and it's really miraculous how you've been able to go through this. The first question, hopefully, is a short one. The BAAs that you're talking about, are they structured to do not only contracts but cooperative agreements, or just contracts?
So so I'll answer them in turn so I don't miss it. So the BAAs that we're looking at right now with Arlene and Joe and the team, we will provide as much flexibility as we can. Typically cooperative agreements obviously are solicited through a notice of funding opportunity announcement process. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't award cooperative agreements through a BAA. It's just that we have to kind of make that tie together. Again, because it is a different, assistance versus acquisition, two different mechanisms, two different kind of, end goals, and then kind of two different authorities. But yeah, we are going to try to tie that in. I will certainly say from the acquisition perspective, OTAs and FAR-based instruments, will be awarded off of BAA or even like CSO like initiatives. So that hopefully answers your first question.
Yes, thank you. The second two, I'm going to let you pontificate on. So one is I know BARDA is very used to using the COMPETES Act prize authority. I'd be interested in your comments on that. And secondly, we just heard about DPA authorities. How does your organization and ASPR contracting play into how DPA is administered by ASPR?
So yeah, certainly BARDA does, take advantage of the prize authority, and that's not necessarily something that Arlene and Joe have spoken about, but certainly something that we can, talk about and think about as well. I mean, if there are unique challenges, because I mean, the prize challenges, those are uniquely situated for specific requirements, and Arlene and Joe and I have not specifically talked about any requirements within IBMSC that would benefit from that type of competitive mechanism, but certainly an option that is available to us. And again, kind of going along with my comments, all of the above, open to anything that actually meets IBMSC's requirements. In terms of DPA, so I kind of look at DPA as kind of like not two different things, but kind of two different ways of thinking about it. Ultimately there's the, government is going to intervene in a marketplace to ensure XYZ, product, raw material, anything is available. That may or may not actually involve an ASPR contract, right? So I may have equities there if we're intervening in a market for me to buy it for Arlene and Joe, or for me to buy it for SNS, or for me to buy it for someone else, or I may not. And then, Arlene and Joe in their DPA office, and I think that was a earlier presentation, they just may be intervening to ensure that there's appropriate supply in the commercial marketplace, right? So I think it can go one of both ways. I think it typically goes the way of I'm not necessarily involved from an ASPR contracting perspective, because then they're intervening to ensure things are available in the commercial marketplace. But certainly I could get involved if we need to intervene for a specific reason, like if SNS is having some kind of difficulty procuring some product or something like that because of XYZ reason. They could intervene, and then ultimately I could probably provide a specific or instant purchase for that to kind of prop up that marketplace if we do intervene in the market. So I look at it in both ways. And I think there was one more over here. Sorry, it's not like Teams where the hands it's numbered,
Just a quick question. I know you guys are dealing with getting the requirements to fit in the budget. Any way you guys can actually share long forecasts, like yearly forecasts of opening solicitations, CSOs, anything that would give the industry better outlook so we can plan better?
Yes, so certainly. I mean, I think that, to the extent that, Arlene and Joe, because again, when we're looking at kind of contracting specifically in federal procurement, we got to understand kind of the lines of demarcation between program and contracting, right? So to the extent that Arlene and Joe, I know that sometimes it's a tough budget situation and they kind of are not quite sure, but to the extent that they can provide that forward planning, yeah, certainly we're happy to provide it. In any number of methods. There's kind of small business forecasts, which are not just for small business, but we post them. They are targeted for small business, but not necessarily specifically for small business to kind of provide that mechanism. Obviously, HHS has mechanisms where they roll up requirements from all the different operating and staff divisions and post them online. And ASPR does play in all of those kind of mechanisms to communicate information. So yeah, we definitely would want to do that to the extent that it's practical and the extent that we can, because I think the other danger, at least from my perspective, in sharing things like that, it's good planning. But in this kind of, again, boom and bust cycle of the funding, it's like we put things out and we don't necessarily want to kind of send a signal to industry that we're not going to be able to, kind of carry out. So I think that's a little bit of a risk that I see. We want to share, we want to be open, but I also don't want to send false information or false hopes that I really can't carry through in the end. So it's kind of that delicate balancing act between contracting and program.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious as to whether there are any contracts in place today within ASPR or available to ASPR that support the acquisition of tools or data sets or professional services that would contribute directly to your prowess for truly having visibility into global supply chains and the varying disciplines, regulatory, trade kind of expertise to support your mission.
So yeah, I will say that this is an emerging kind of field, at ASPR, specifically, data and visibility into supply chains. We do have several mechanisms, there's the legacy, supply chain control tower and other things that are there. And I know that, we're looking at being more sophisticated about that, particularly with IBMSC. I know other program offices also play in that space. But, maybe Arlene and Joe, not that you have the mic, but, to the extent that we want to think about that for the future and think about other contracts. But I know, yes, there are things, both from a professional services perspective, from an IT perspective, from a data perspective. These are all things that we're looking at to kind of have that greater visibility, but I don't think there's any specific bespoke procurements ready that are fully baked to kind of go out right now. So.